Hello everybody, my name is Stephen Redman. Welcome to Pastor's Library. This is the channel where we discuss everything to do with theology books. Books that might have been on a reading list for a seminary course, for a bachelor's degree or a master's degree in theology or in biblical studies, or perhaps just books that have piqued your interest. Maybe you're doing a little bit of studying at home and you want some guidance. Well, we try to do that week by week. If you like what we do here, please leave us a thumbs up on YouTube because it makes a lot of difference to the algorithm. And what I would also like to remind you of is to subscribe if you haven't done already and click on the bell, and that will make sure you know when we release another episode. So today we're going to talk a little bit about an introduction to theodicy. Theodicy. This is the subject that covers God and goodness versus evil and why is there so much trouble in the world and all that type of thing. Theodicy was a word coined by Leibniz in Germany, the great mathematician and the co-author of calculus, which might be enough to make you want to forget him totally. But you can get a reprint of his book on theodicy for about £7 in the UK, which is quite remarkably good. And for some reason, I can't put my hand on it. I've been searching high and low for the last hour and a half, and I figure it's time to get on and make the film. So you just have to trust me. I've got it and I've read it. But even though it's old, it is a very worthwhile read, because if you want to understand theodicy, read the person who coined the name. Okay, so I want to just give you a few bits of background reading. I studied theodicy a lot for my master's degree, and I read a lot of things for my dissertation. And I'd just like to introduce you to a few books, some of which are not strictly theology, but I would suggest are essential reading for theodicy. And this is only a tiny part, but I don't want this video to go on for long, and we'll do some more. So there's this guy called Elie Wiesel, or Wiesel, I think it's Wiesel. He wrote The Trial of God, which is a worthwhile read on this subject. And Wiesel actually won the Nobel Peace Prize. And it's for this book called Night. Now, this book, I would suggest to you, it's written by a Jew. It's written out of his experience of Auschwitz. Parts of it are barbaric, but I would suggest to you, if you're really going to start studying theodicy and trying to understand, as a pastor, I found that the hardest question to answer 20 years ago was, why do bad things happen to good people? How can God be good if all this stuff happens in the world? And like me, you probably had an answer that was intuitive, but I wanted to get down to what do other people say? What are the good answers? And in Elie Wiesel's Night, for example, it talks about 3 prisoners in chains, and among them, the little people, the sad-eyed angel. The SS seemed more preoccupied, more worried than usual. To hang a child in front of thousands of onlookers was not a small matter. The head of the camp read the verdict. All eyes were on the child. He was pale, almost calm, but he was biting his lips as he stood in the shadow of the gallows. The 3 condemned prisoners together stepped onto the chairs. In unison, the nooses were placed around their necks. Long live liberty, shouted the 2 men, but the boy was silent. Where is merciful God? Where is he? Someone behind me was asking. At the signal, the 3 chairs were tipped over. Total silence in the camp. On the horizon, the sun was setting. Caps off, came the scream. As for the rest of us, we were weeping. Cover your heads. Then came the march past. The 2 men were no longer alive. Their tongues were hanging out, swollen and bluish. But the 3rd rope was still moving. The child, too light, was still breathing. And so he remained for more than half an hour. And just skipping a little bit, it says, behind me I heard the same man asking, for God's sake, where is God? And from within me I heard a voice answer, where he is, this is where, hanging from this gallows. I would suggest that's a really interesting place to start a study of theodicy, because this Jew recognises that somewhere God is in this. And you can take that reading a couple of ways. And if you read other books that mention it, you will find there is a lot more to be said on that subject. But he's definitely worth a read. Now, the other Jewish guy that I would really recommend on this is Harold Kushner. Now, he wrote When Bad Things Happen to Good People, which is probably the most essential theodicy book that is out there. If you can see, I have got so many pages marked here, and they're not all for us today. This book was it was released initially in 1981. My version's are 2002. But this is a very worthwhile book, still sells buckets. Mine says 20th anniversary edition. So here we have a few quotes for you. Maybe God does not cause our suffering. Maybe it happens for some reason other than the will of God. The psalmist writes, I lift my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord, maker of heaven and earth. Psalm 121. He does not say my pain comes from the Lord or my tragedy comes from the Lord. He says my help comes from the Lord. And I do find that this rabbi has some good insights on the subject that we're talking about. Talking about Job, he points out that Job complains against God. And it's the friends who uphold the conventional theology, the idea that no ills befall the righteous. In other words, if something happens to you that's bad, it's because you've been a bad boy. And I think it's good that he recognises that side of the argument. He also recognises something that's much more helpful. He also says that forced to choose between a good God who is not totally powerful or a powerful God who is not totally good, the author of the book of Job chooses to believe in God's goodness. And you can agree with that or disagree with it. But if you're going to study the subject of theodicy, I would suggest that's an argument you have to engage with. Now, obviously, you may well want to read lots of commentaries on the book of Job. And I think that's why I have slightly more commentaries on the book of Job than of anything else. But there's a great podcast that you maybe ought to connect with called Everything Happens for a Reason. There's a book of that title as well by the person who does this podcast. And that's a brilliant thing to connect with as well. It's also the title of the first chapter in the book of Job, When Bad Things Happen to a Good Person, which is Harold Kushner's commentary on Job. And he starts this off by saying that as a human race, we look for patterns. You know, when I read this, I thought it was only me that thought that. But I was instantly won over to him by his recognition that we do look for patterns. We look for reasons why. Why could this be? Why would it not be? This is a very worthwhile read, believe me. If that was at the beginning of the book, at the end of the book, we have, I find my own answer to Job's question, both the personal response and the theological answer, in Job's last 7 words. Like Job, I have met God. I have met him in the sunshine, but more often in the shadows. Not in the elegant perfection of the world, but in the resilience of the human soul, the ability of people to find even a pain-filled life, even a grossly unfair life, worth living. He goes on from that. But I would just suggest to you, this is a really brilliant book to read. And yet we're not really talking about Christian theology here. But if that doesn't help you walk through to Christian theology, I don't know what will. Here are 2 books by the French author Albert Camus. Camus is not a Christian, but in his 1947 book, which is called The Plague, which is a piece of fiction, a plague visits a small French town and its victims die in a horrifying death. This is written mainly as an allegory to French suffering in the Second World War. But it questions the love and grace of God and the traditional view of suffering. And I would suggest to you, this is largely an amazing piece of work. I found this necessary to quote this in my dissertation, and you'll be amazed how many Christians quote this in their works on theodicy. It really is quite a powerful book. And written in 1947, 238 pages, a brilliant read. He actually has another book which I would include in this, which is his 1951 work called The Rebel. Now, this is a critique of communism, but it also focuses an awful lot on a book that we're going to look at next, which is Fyodor Dostoevsky's Karamazov Brothers. Depending on the version you've got, it'll either be called The Brothers Karamazov or The Karamazov Brothers. It's the same thing. This is a really big read, but Camus identifies key passages in it and quotes from it, and he really tries to help us see some of the issues raised by this book. And he goes into lots of other things too in this rebellious book against communism that really is a very, very helpful book on Christian theodicy as well. Now, The Brothers Karamazov is absolutely stunning. My copy here is 869 pages. It's really huge. It takes some reading. And I remember working my way through this during a week when I was pushing on for my closing date for my dissertation in my master's, and it really took some processing. But I have to say, this is a great read for anybody studying theodicy. And I just want to give you a couple of quotes from this. This has some passages which are unpleasant to read, but they really make you ask yourself, which God do we believe in? So this tells a story of a serf boy, that's S-E-R-F, not S-U-R-F, a little child of 8 who throws a stone when playing and hurts the paw of the general's favourite hound. "Why is my favourite dog lame?" he says. And they all pointed at this kid, and so he says, "So you did it." So the general looked the child up and down. "Take him," he said. He was taken from his mother and kept shut up all night. Early the next morning, the general comes out on horseback with the hounds, his dependents, his dog boys, huntsmen, all mounted around him in full hunting parade. The servants are summoned for their edification, and in front of them all stands the mother of the child. The child is brought from the lockup. It's a gloomy, cold, foggy autumn day, a capital day for hunting. The general orders the child to be undressed. The child is stripped naked. He shivers, numb with terror, not daring to cry. "Make him run," commands the general. "Run, run," shout the dog boys. The boy runs. "At him," yells the general, and he sets the whole pack of hounds on the child. The hounds catch him and tear him to pieces before his mother's eyes. And that's enough of that. Now, why is it I'm giving you quotes that are literally very unpleasant? Because life has got a lot of unpleasantness in it. As a family, we faced living on a ward for 9 months when our son had cancer, and my son was sharing a room with 3 other children who were facing a cancer diagnosis as well. And we walked for almost 3 years until he died. And it was a traumatic time. And I can talk to you, if you want to compare notes on how bad our lives are, oh, come on, let's go outside now, I'll soon sort you out. You know, I can tell you about how bad life can be. I've got a mate who, his daughter was killed on the Lockerbie plane. She was 19 and my son was 7 when he died. And for years, we have debated these issues between the two of us. Can I say, I think we're both very well adjusted. But John would say to me, oh, we were talking about you the other night and we were saying, oh, how much worse it was for you than for us. You know, for us it was all over in a minute, but for you, it was a 3-year journey. And I remember saying to him, well, that's amazing, John. We were talking about you the other night and we were saying the same, that it must have been so much worse for you that you sat down in front of the TV, your wife gives you a cup of tea, you sat there drinking it and the headline comes up, Pan Am 103 downed over Lockerbie. You know, we both thought the other had it worse. And then one year I went to a Christian conference and I'm sat there having my breakfast. And they asked, would I mind if this couple came and sat at this table that I was solely occupying at the time? And I said, fine, yeah. And I said, hello. And I carried on looking at my book. And this woman never took her eyes off me. And I was getting a little bit twitchy about this. So I said to her, can I do anything to help you? And she said to me, oh, yes, you wrote that book, didn't you? And so I said, well, and this tells you I can be a bit facetious in the morning when I haven't had my breakfast. And I said to her, well, I've written a book. Whether or not it's that book, I don't know. You would have to give me some more details. And then all of a sudden, I just realised. And I said to her, no, you tell me your story. And she told me how her 16-year-old son had disappeared while backpacking. And the body had never been found. And after 7 years, they declared him dead. But, you know, they have never even had the dignity of being able to bury his corpse. And I rang up my friend John and I said, John, you know, we've had this banter over the years. It was worse for you. It was worse for me. Let me tell you someone who that it was worse for. And I think sometimes when we are pastoring people, when we are just walking down life's avenues, walking through the supermarket, we can meet people that are in a terrible state, often far worse than us. And realistically, we have to have a love towards them, a recognition that God loves them. And it's no help to say to them, oh, it was just the will of God, as a certain well-known American preacher has said about the 9/11 plane crashes. You know, that doesn't help anybody. I also believe it's a misdescription of our God. I think God's far bigger than that, far more loving than that. But what I am saying to you is that we need to recognise there are all these things going on. There are all these terrible situations, and we need to be able to handle them. So for many years now, I've done lectures to people about where is God when children suffer, or where is God when people suffer. I give pastors visiting their churches, I give them a list of titles and they can pick one, and I will speak on that. And I will always bring the conversation that I'm having with people round to this thing. God is good, and we need to recognise that. And I just think somehow my studies in theodicy have helped me with that. And they've helped me recognise that I should not be sat in a corner crying into my soup over the death of my son, but I should be recognising the extreme goodness of God, that 24 years later, I am sat here in my right mind, and God has been good to me in those years. And he was good to me in those 3 years that my son Rocky was fighting for life too. Now, another time I'm going to go through with you a range of theology books on the issue of theodicy. But I'm just going to give you one to whet your appetite, because I think this is a really good one. It's part of the Cascade Companions series, which I found these books to be brilliant. None of them are very big. I mean, this is 105 pages, including its bibliography, and it's written by someone called Daniel Costello. And the minute I picked this book up, I fell in love with it. It's dealing with this relationship between God and evil, and it challenges in some ways the traditional views of theodicy. But here's just a little couple of tidbits to whet your appetite. He says virtually every contemporary discussion of the theodicy question is premised on an understanding of God overwhelmingly constrained by the principles of 17th and 18th century philosophical theism. And if you say, well, what does that mean? Well, think about it. You know, it is true that sometimes, because theodicy came about, it was coined in that era, it is very much tainted with the theology that was popular in that day. And he goes on and he says this: the book of Job serves a very important function within the biblical canon, to call into question the logic that the covenant implies a simple set of transactions. That is, good things are in store for all who abide by the Torah, while affliction attends everyone who does not. And he goes on and says that you might summarise the book of Job with the two words, just deserts. But of course, the whole thing about the book of Job is that Job is innocent. And God may permit what happens to Job, but in a very real sense, God does not will it. And this distinction, as fine as it is, will play a pivotal role in what follows. Loads more I could say about this book. If you wanted a cheap place to start reading theodicy, get this book by Daniel Costello. It's absolutely brilliant. But please believe me, you will want to read those other books, even the fictional ones, because they really raise these issues. And I think what is absolutely true is even in works of fiction by non-Christians, these questions have been asked for a long time and they deserve an answer. And perhaps if nothing else, you might do well to read up on theodicy and understand what the Bible really teaches, that we might be able to give people a coherent answer and project to them what is simply the truth, that the gospel is good news. I hope you've liked this today. If so, please remember the thumbs up. Please subscribe and click on the bell if you haven't done already. And I'll see you next time on Pastor's Library. Until then, bye!